Today I want to open up a discussion about lens mounts, specifically about the Canon lens mount lineup and where are they going to go with it in the future. Because they're in a bit of a tricky situation at the minute, because themselves, like Sony and Nikon, have entered the full-frame mirrorless market after having done APS-C mirrorless cameras, and before all of that were doing DSLRs. But all three companies have kind of taken different approaches as to how they're dealing with the situation. You see, originally when it was DSLRs, you had Canon using the EF mount, Nikon using the F mount, and Sony using the A mount. In 2010, Sony released the Nex 3 and Nex 5, which were APS-C mirrorless cameras, and for that they introduced the E mount. And then the following year, in 2011, Nikon introduced the J1, which used the new 1 series lens mount. Followed the year after, in 2012, with Canon bringing out the EOS M mirrorless camera and introducing the EF-M lineup. So at this point, all three camera manufacturers are in the DSLR market with one lens mount and mirrorless cameras with a different lens mount. And then 2013 rolls around, Sony decides to build on their mirrorless success and bring out the A7, which was their first full-frame mirrorless camera. With this, they took a bit of a calculated risk, and rather than bring out a whole new lens mount specifically for full frame, they stuck with the E mount and just fitted a full frame sensor behind it. This does produce some potential problems in as much as it makes lens design a lot trickier and does kind of restrict how fast an aperture you can get on some lenses. But I think realistically you can get fast enough lenses for the majority of people, so I think Sony decided rather than bring out a whole new lens mount, they would kind of just bear the brunt of the limitations and stick with the E mount. For the next few years, it stayed pretty much like this, with Sony being the only one focused on full-frame mirrorless cameras. They brought out the A7, the A7R, the A7S, then they brought out the second and third generations of all of them, and the A9. During this time, the only things mirrorless-wise that we saw from Canon and Nikon, Canon brought out the M2, the M3, the M5, then the M6, then most recently the M50. But they haven't really been doing a whole lot in terms of lenses. Nikon brought out a few bodies over the years as well. That finished up in 2015 with their last release, which was the J5. And then earlier this year, in July 2018, they announced that they were discontinuing the 1 series cameras completely. Fast forward to the present day, and we have both Canon and Nikon now entering the full-frame mirrorless market as well. Nikon with the Z mount cameras and Canon with the RF mount cameras. Now this presents a bit of a question mark about what are Canon going to do. Now obviously Sony still have the A mount, although they don't really focus on that anymore, and then they just have the E mount, which deals with both their APS-C and full-frame mirrorless cameras. Nikon have the F mount for DSLRs. How much they were going to continue with that remains to be seen, but they have the F mount for DSLRs and they have the Z mount for mirrorless cameras. Now it's not inconceivable to imagine that in the very near future we could see an APS-C mirrorless camera from Nikon in the Z mount, because they currently don't have an APS-C mirrorless camera. Canon, however, have split themselves up into different directions, because they have the EF mount for DSLRs, they have the EF-M mount for APS-C mirrorless cameras, and now they have the RF mount for mirrorless full frame. However, the RF and EF-Ms aren't compatible with each other. You can use the current EF mount lenses on both the EF-M and the RF camera using the relevant adapters, but there's physically no way of using an EF-M on an RF camera or an RF lens on the EF-M camera. Now my kind of initial reaction to this scenario was Canon would be better off phasing out the EF-M mount and bringing out an RF mount APS-C camera. That way they could introduce the equivalent of like RFS lenses for APS-C and RF for full frame, and basically mirror what they've done with the DSLR lineup on their mirrorless cameras. However, at the same time that they announced the EOS R, they also announced a new 32mm f1.4 EF-M lens And there's also growing speculation now about a potential announcement of an M5 Mark II and an M6 Mark II, which means if they're Mark IIs of current EFM cameras, you presume they're going to stay with EFM. So how is all that going to work further down the line? Because I know for my position, and I'm sure probably a lot of people viewing this now who shoot full frame were in the same scenario, is that when you came through the lineups of DSLRs, you initially started off on APS-C. Your first DSLR was probably APS-C, maybe had a few EFS lenses or APS-C lenses, and then you could kind of grow a collection of full frame compatible lenses whilst using your APS-C camera, so that when you then hit the tipping point and decide you want to change from an APS-C to a full frame body, you've already got the lenses there to use, so you've only got to replace the body itself. Now, I'll make no secret that I think DSLRs are going to slowly start to fade out. It's much like every other technology on the planet that used to exist that now doesn't. It'll gradually disappear. As more and more focus is put towards mirrorless cameras, there'll be less attention on DSLRs, so it becomes less of a priority for the manufacturers until eventually they kind of just give it up and focus entirely on mirrorless. So let's say, hypothetically, I don't know, 10 years down the line, DSLRs are dead and buried and we're solely on mirrorless cameras. If Canon are using EFM for APS-C and RF for full frame, that means anyone who's buying into the Canon ecosystem as a new photographer is going to start off on APS-C with the EFM lenses. They're not going to be able to buy RF lenses because they won't work on the EFM mount, so they're going to have to buy only EFM lenses. Then if they decide that they want to progress onto a full frame camera, they've got to not only change the body but all of the lenses as well, which is probably going to put a few people off wanting to switch at all just from the sheer cost of it all. But also, one of the big incentives that dissuades people from changing camera systems currently is they're already invested in a bunch of lenses. So for example, there's probably a lot of people on one system at the minute who are looking at other camera systems and thinking, I'd love to get that camera, but my current lenses won't work with it and I don't want to change all my lenses. So if you're putting people in a position where you're saying, right, you want to move from APS-C to full frame, you're going to have to sell everything and start from scratch anyway, that's going to open up the door for a lot more people to think, well, I'm changing all my equipment anyway, I might as well change manufacturer. So it seems logical that at some point, if Canon are going to continue with this APS-C and full frame mirrorless camera, that it would make sense that they work on the same mount. But if they're going to change the APS-C mount, surely they're better off doing it sooner rather than later. Because for my mind, it seems a bit pointless spending a load of kind of money and R&D time growing the EFM lineup, the lenses and the cameras, if at some point they're going to have to change it to a different mount entirely. Surely they'd be better to do it sooner rather than later, phase out the EFM now, and get everybody onto the RF mount if that's where they're going long term. But what do you guys reckon? Do you think this is going to cause Canon a headache further down the line? Do you think it's not going to be an issue at all? Or is there another solution to this that maybe I'm missing? Leave your thoughts and comments in the box down below. Thank you so much for stopping by, and hopefully I will see you in the next video.